In 2002, I went down to the Loring Hall Cinema over in Hingham, Massachusetts, to see a movie called Punch Drunk Love. I was 16, and this movie was being advertised in a way that was guaranteed to intrigue a teenage boy around the turn of the millennium. This was supposed to be the Adam Sandler comedy for grown-ups. I did not know anything about the director of this movie, Paul Thomas Anderson, but I bought a ticket and I found myself assaulted by the experience. This movie is strange and eerie and violent. It's got this heavy percussive sound design and this stressful lighting scheme with heavy darks and blinding lights. And it was like nothing I had ever seen. And so I figured that made it terrible. I decided that I hated Paul Thomas Anderson and everything that he represented. I'm here tonight to talk about my book on Paul Thomas Anderson, so suffice it to say that perspective has changed. But first we're going to double back to the beginning. As the legend goes, there was once a 7-year-old boy who wrote in his notebook, "I want to be a writer, producer, director, special effects man. I know how to do everything and I know everything." For better or worse, and often both, Paul Thomas Anderson has essentially maintained that perspective on his own work. He knows how to do everything, and increasingly he does. In his last 2 movies, he has operated without a credited cinematographer, given that he has essentially absorbed that role. And especially at the beginning, his conviction that he knows everything could occasionally get him into trouble. Anderson has made 9 movies in the past 25 years, and I like to break them into groups of 3, which I call his thesis, antithesis, and synthesis movies. In his first 3 movies, Hard 8, Boogie Nights, and Magnolia, he assertively declared what a Paul Thomas Anderson movie is and what that name represents, and he demanded to be taken as seriously as possible, as early in his career as possible, even at the expense of his relationships with the people paying for his movies. These movies are big and loud and declarative. They wear their influences on their sleeves, and they tend to focus on sprawling ensembles. In his next 3 movies, he went from thesis to antithesis, with 3 movies, Punch Drunk Love, There Will Be Blood, and The Master, that turned everything inside out. He has talked about having gotten sick of how he did things, wanting to break everything down and reassemble it as something new. So these movies are strange, they are often quiet, the use of their influences is a bit more unusual, and they focus on single, repressed protagonists. In this phase, he also got a lot less big and brash. He tended to retreat from the public eye between movies. In his third, most recent phase, his synthesis phase, he has made these 3 movies that seem in conversation with the 3 that came before, as though he's running back through his filmography and relaxing the tension that was present in each of his previous 3 features. So with Inherent Vice, he re-teamed with the star of The Master, his last movie, Joaquin Phoenix, and he replaced a tense alcoholic character with a loose, stoned one. With Phantom Thread, he re-teamed with the star of There Will Be Blood, the movie that came before that, Daniel Day-Lewis, and he traded a brutal character for a more genteel one. And with Licorice Pizza, he looked back to Punch Drunk Love and took an eerie, off-putting vision of the San Fernando Valley and flipped it to expose a bright and joyful world of youthful possibility. Speaking of the San Fernando Valley, Anderson is a filmmaker unusually associated with his native region. He has set 6 of his 9 movies in Southern California and 4 of those in the Valley, a suburban region of LA that lies over the hills from Hollywood. This is the setting for Boogie Nights, Magnolia, Punch Drunk Love, and Licorice Pizza, and it is an area that Anderson clearly adores, but it is one that he has struggled with his relationship to. He claims to be really embarrassed about being from the Valley, compared with directors who had fled fascism or fought in armed combat or even been raised in more theoretically interesting places like Chicago and New York. As a result, he decided that his films should be FU celebrations of the Valley, though he did not say FU. It's as though he was hitting back against anyone who thought the Valley was an uninteresting place to make movies. And so you can see a kind of tension in Boogie Nights, Magnolia, and Punch Drunk Love, this effort to make the Valley, which at least at that time had a wide reputation as a sort of cultural desert. Going off script, does anybody know the movie Valley Girl? That sort of created this image of the Valley as this horrible place where people just like talked like this, and they all had big hair, and they all like went to the mall, and it was like so totally bitchin'. But he wanted to make this seem like a worthy place to tell stories, and that meant he wanted to make the Valley look normal. That was a big buzzword of his around this time. The Valley is normal. So he is simultaneously trying to make his home area seem remarkable and normal. And that results in these movies that have kind of an ambivalent relationship to their own setting. With Magnolia, he wanted to make the ultimate San Fernando Valley movie, the mother of all San Fernando Valley movies. But he was trying so hard to make the Valley seem normal that he made it seem very vague and unspecific. And then 20 years later with Licorice Pizza, he finally managed to make enough peace with being from the Valley that he was able to make a movie that actually celebrated its specificities, pardon me, mainly its adjacents to Hollywood, which he basically ignored in every other movie that he has set in the Valley. Another little wrinkle in how Anderson presents the Valley is his representation of its demographic makeup. He has taken heat in the past for the relative lack of non-white characters in his movies, and that is a bit of a simplification. A movie like Phantom Thread about upper crust London in the 50s, it's going to make most sense with a generally white cast. But it's undeniable that in both Magnolia and Licorice Pizza, he depicts an area with a diverse ethnic makeup as overwhelmingly white. When he was asked about this in promoting Magnolia, he argued that he was just trying to be realistic, because that's as much color as you would encounter during a day in the Valley. And that's a sentiment that seems to take his own perspective for granted. That may be as much color as he was likely to see in the Valley, but Magnolia is an ensemble drama with a huge network of characters. It is very much trying to depict a cross-section of the Valley, and the only meaningful characters in that cross-section are the white ones. And what is really remarkable is that he took heat for this in 1999, and then he did the exact same thing with Licorice Pizza in 2021. There are even fewer non-white faces in that movie. And this is not to say that every movie needs to have a perfectly ethnically balanced cast, but when you're trying to conjure these portraits of an entire swath of Southern California, the singular focus on white faces seems notable. Another way that people have been talking about Anderson since he emerged in the 90s is as a repository of influences rather than a unique cinematic voice. He is someone who has always been really open about borrowing from his favorite filmmakers, and at different moments in his career, he has gravitated towards different influences. He started off making a David Mamet ripoff, then he adopted a real Scorsese energy with sort of quick kinetic storytelling, a cocaine energy, as he said it in retrospect. And later he graduated to sort of a John Huston thing. In Phantom Thread, he's openly emulating Alfred Hitchcock. But there are a few directors that he has been compared with consistently over the course of his career, two of which I think are perfectly apt, and two of which strike me as a little bit deeper. So first up is Robert Altman. Altman was known for working with big, sprawling casts, something that Anderson was certainly doing a lot of in the beginning of his career. He also had a very loose, improvisational feel to his movies, so he has come up a lot in talking about the loose and shaggy Inherent Vice and Licorice Pizza, though those movies are both more tightly scripted than any Altman movie that's in the conversation. It is a comparison that Anderson was happy to invite. He said early in his career that he would be very glad to be known as Little Bobby Altman, and it's a relationship that he would go on to pursue to the point that Altman became kind of a mentor. When Altman was making his last movie, A Prairie Home Companion, he was in poor health, and the insurance company demanded that he have another director with him on set to guarantee that the movie could be finished if Altman died mid-production. A real unambiguous passing of the torch moment came when Altman chose Paul Thomas Anderson. Altman did survive production of Prairie Home Companion, incidentally, and died shortly thereafter, and left behind this beautiful, really elegiac movie. Perfect coda, if anybody's interested in that one. All that said, Anderson has said that what he likes most in Altman's movies is his willingness to be rough and spit shine it, which is something that the technically polished Anderson has never had much interest in doing. Another director who is heavily featured in discussion of Anderson is Stanley Kubrick, who is much more aligned with the technically polished elements of Anderson's filmmaking. He is also a director whose stories were very much arranged elliptically, as they say, by which I mean the storytelling features a lot of ellipses, those sort of dot moments. So the movies are not necessarily chained together in the typical, this happened, so this happened, but then this happened, so this happened, sort of cause and effect rhythm. Anderson's movies, starting with There Will Be Blood, are really guided by the jump ahead storytelling rhythm to the point that something like Licorice Pizza is made up of unexplained time jumps. It's hard to watch Licorice Pizza, which is a movie about two kids starting a waterbed business, among other things, and say that was put together like a Kubrick movie, but that is exactly how Anderson operates. He has this Kubrickian influence of elliptical storytelling. But the two influences that I find most interesting to talk about are Robert Downey Sr. and Jonathan Demme, two directors who are maybe not brand names in the way that Altman and Kubrick are, but whose influence upon Anderson has been profound. So first off, there is Robert Downey Sr., who is, unsurprisingly, the father of Robert Downey Jr. He was this bastion of underground filmmaking in the 60s and 70s. He made these avant-garde satires that were often pretty extreme in content and imagery, and incidentally loved to put his little tiny son Robert in these off-the-wall horrible satires and have him say just the most horrible things. Interesting guy. And then there was Demme, who was sort of a journeyman auteur, going from genre to genre, making movies that often became classics of that genre, like Stop Making Sense for the concert film, Silence of the Lambs for the cop thriller, Philadelphia for the courtroom drama. So, on the one hand, we have this aggressive outsider artist, and on the other we have this classic populist director. But Anderson talks about the two of them in basically the same terms. He loves to talk about how they are both selfish in the best way possible. They follow their own instincts, they have their own bliss, they create work that makes them happy, and they just trust that enough of the audience is going to be interested in the same things that they are interested in. So that is what Anderson took away from two of his favorite directors who both became close friends, the ability to be selfish in a way that makes you happy, but selfless in a way that invites other people into your world. Selfless selfishness, I see as a real Paul Thomas Anderson hallmark. So I like to call Anderson a romantic filmmaker, but I generally mean it not in the lowercase r love story way so much as the uppercase R way that refers to 18th century romantic philosophers and artists who were awed by the ungovernable power of the human heart and found themselves confronted by a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, to quote William Wordsworth. So that means something in a Paul Thomas Anderson movie. What does that mean? Well, it has to do with both family and romance. To begin with, Anderson makes movies about family. That is one of the most common ways of describing his work. It's how he described it himself when he was getting started. He would give interviews saying, "I make movies about family." But in reality, there are very, very, very few intact families in the Paul Thomas Anderson canon. He has made movies about found families and surrogate families. But if his movies are about family, they are generally about the ways that families fall apart. Just about every one of his movies is about a protagonist who is alienated from their home, whether they were thrown out, in the case of poor Dirk Diggler here, whether they ran away, they were orphaned, whatever the case may be. And this becomes a psychic wound that they can never quite soothe, this loss of home. There is a significant scene in The Master in which the protagonist, a returning World War II veteran, is asked about a recent psychologically worrying crying jag, and he explains that he was suffering from an attack of nostalgia. And that seems to be another message of the Anderson canon. As he has said in interviews, it is worth remembering that for large parts of history, nostalgia has been classified as a medical condition. And then there is the issue of romance in the Anderson canon. If you look at his love stories, they most often have something to do with the conflation of loving someone and wanting to hurt them, which can be a bit disturbing. But particularly in Punch Drunk Love and Phantom Thread, that notion of the heart being so overwhelmed that the brain can't quite function is definitely present. In Punch Drunk Love, we have a movie where pillow talk involves wanting to bash each other's brains in. The characters are feeling such extreme emotions toward each other that the wires seem to get crossed, and they process their love as a desire to destroy each other. And that is an idea that is echoed in Phantom Thread, in which the characters can only find balance in their marriage by coming up with an arrangement in which she is allowed to poison him at regular intervals. These are vaguely transgressive ideas that loving and hurting could be intertwined, but it's notable that in either case Anderson is positing the transgressive route as basically being a more efficient avenue towards a pretty conventional concept of a male-female romantic pairing. He likes to play with transgressive ideas, but he is ultimately a director who is happy returning things right back to the status quo rather than proposing any more significant revision of social standards. Of course, you could argue that the ending of Licorice Pizza changes things a bit. That's a movie that does end with the implication of a romantic relationship between a teenage boy and a 20-something woman, which is his most openly transgressive choice yet. So we'll have to see whether he gets any more adventurous in that department. So that covers how Anderson handles domestic relationships. But I also find it really interesting how he handles gender. Going about 20 years now, his movies have almost always boiled down to two figures who stand on opposite sides of some ideological divide when it comes to gender performance. We have these pairs of men, almost always men, one of whom is more classically masculine and one of whom is less so. You have the awkward, sensitive Barry and the cruel, disgusting mattress man in Punch Drunk Love. Here you have the brutal oil man versus the more effete preacher in There Will Be Blood. The list goes on. Even in Phantom Thread, which really only has one notable male character, he flips things and covers two opposing women, one of whom is more classically feminine, one of whom is less so. And it might be easiest to suggest that the movies would end with some suggestion that one mode of gender performance is superior to the other. But that is not really how it tends to work in an Anderson movie. It is more appropriate to say that the characters need to merge in some way and absorb qualities of each other, and the ones who can't do so tend to be the losers. It's an idea that becomes literal in Inherent Vice, which ends with the cop and the bothersome hippie facing off and suddenly speaking in unison, literally being merged for a brief period of time, as though they have passed through each other and come out the other side with some residue of the other person still present on them. One side note when it comes to gender performance, if Anderson is interested in what some people have called the feminized male, men who exhibit traits that are not considered traditionally masculine, he started his career by creating two, quote-unquote, feminized men in the gay characters of Scotty, Philip Seymour Hoffman's character in Boogie Nights, and Donnie, William H. Macy's character in Magnolia. It is kind of fascinating. Anderson created two characters in back-to-back movies who trace basically the same trajectory. They are both hopelessly in love with men who are out of their league. They pathetically pine until they get drunk and confess their feelings in these tearful, embarrassing breakdowns. And then they are humiliated so entirely that Hoffman's character is essentially ejected from the movie, and Macy goes on to ruin his face and maybe his life. It's a pretty brutal punishment for two basically innocent characters. And as with his treatment of race, it seems to raise some questions as to Anderson's storytelling priorities, particularly given that he then did not create another gay character until Licorice Pizza, which features a closeted politician based on the real-life Joel Wax. Wax is not punished quite as dramatically as Scotty and Donnie, but his sexuality is again painted as a tragic aspect of his story. He is horribly cruel to the boyfriend that he keeps a secret for fear of political repercussions, which is a pretty strong choice to make when the real-life Wax had no such relationship in his life. At some point, there's going to be a fulfilled and functional gay character in a Paul Thomas Anderson movie, and I am looking forward to seeing what that looks like. Now, I'm going to take a few minutes, and I'm going to get really nerdy about the way that movies operate as they hit our brains, because I am really fascinated by some of what Anderson does with the unconscious psychological processes involved in watching a movie. So, basically, there are 5 factors that impact a viewer's ability to comprehend an on-screen narrative. These have been demonstrated by a team of cognitive scientists. And these factors are luminance, the amount of light in the image; color, the amount of color in the image. Obviously, we like to see lighting and color schemes that feel recognizable to us. That helps us process a story. The other factors are a little more technical, and these are shot duration, visual activity, and temporal shot structure. So what do those mean? Basically, we are analyzing how long a shot lasts, how much is happening within the frame between the beginning and end of that shot, and how that shot is arranged in relation to other shots. Is it similarly paced to other shots? Is there a manageable balance of visual activity between the two shots? The arrangements of shots in comparison to each other is especially tricky because there are certain rhythms of shot lengths that are particularly pleasing to our brains, a sort of waveform of shorter and longer shots that helps us process stories with ease. Average editing patterns have been unconsciously drifting in that direction since the dawn of feature-length film. Through trial and error, we have been getting closer and closer to the movie that is edited ideally for the human brain's comprehension. But what Paul Thomas Anderson does is mess with all of it. So for a case study, I am going to use Anderson's movie Inherent Vice, which is a noir mystery that is known for being hopelessly confusing. If you watch the movie enough times, and if you read the Thomas Pynchon book that it's based on a couple of times, you can eventually tease out the story. But it is incredibly hard to process when you're watching it on screen, and it is almost impossible to process the first time. So, Anderson loves a really long shot, by which I mean a shot of extended duration. That is a term with multiple meanings in Hollywood, the long shot. Average shot lengths have been getting shorter with time. We have started with an average shot length of about 10 seconds 100 years ago. Nowadays, the average shot is about 4 seconds. Anderson tends to live in the range of 11 to 15 seconds, so his shots are held on average for quadruple the length of most modern movies. So right away, you've got a feeling and a vibe that is unusual and unique. He is operating with a patience and focus that is more comparable with someone like Ingmar Bergman, who would have shots that lived in that same range. What Anderson does with Inherent Vice, though, is he gives us incredibly long shots that are incredibly dense with plot detail. And our brains do not like to work that way. When we are watching a movie, every time a shot begins, our eye moves towards the center of the frame, because that's where we think the action is going to be. And then we spend the rest of the shot letting our eyes wander the frame, looking for more information, until the next cut brings us back to the center again. So the cuts in a movie are essentially our indication to sit up and focus, and the longer we go without a cut, the harder it is to focus. In Inherent Vice, when you have your private eye sitting in a room listening to a witness and we are getting the whole story told in one extended shot, it is almost impossible to focus on what the witness is saying because our eyes are trying to look away and study the frame for more information. So why is Paul Thomas Anderson sabotaging his story? Because the main character of Inherent Vice is stoned for the entire movie. You know what's really hard when you've been smoking pot all day? Listening to someone tell a long, complex story. So by denying us the comfortable means of processing the story, the back and forth cuts that help us stay alert and focused during dialogue scenes, he puts us in his character's shoes. He sabotages our processing of the story right alongside the character. Turning to Punch Drunk Love, the Adam Sandler movie for grown-ups that upset me so much as a teenager, Anderson is again sabotaging our efforts to settle comfortably into his movie. The lighting and color schemes are remarkably unusual. The frame will have these spheres of extreme brightness next to spheres of extreme shadow. The frame will be extremely white, with pops of primary color, most often the characters' outfits. The movie just looks off. But in Punch Drunk Love, we have the most challenging temporal shot structure in any Anderson movie. When there are scenes of tension in Punch Drunk Love, the rhythm of the shot lengths goes completely haywire. There is no rhythm anymore. It is just random shot lengths being jammed next to each other. And that may sound excessively technical, but when you watch it on screen, the effect is undeniably stressful on a profound level. It is something that transcends simply what is happening on screen. Anderson and his editor, Leslie Jones, are scrambling the movie on a basically cellular level in order to put the audience on edge. And that delights me. So why does he do these things? Why is he so intent on messing with our heads and making it hard or stressful to process his stories? Well, I see it as akin to the distancing effects of Brechtian theater, those techniques, often called alienation effects, that prevent the audience from losing themselves in the story, on the logic that a fully awake audience, an audience that was being provoked by reminders that they are watching a constructed work of art rather than slipping into a dream world, would be a more engaged one. You alienate the audience in order to draw them closer. Because if you're making a movie about a stoned detective, you put the audience in the main character's shoes by making the story confusing. You completely immerse them in the story, even if it's uncomfortable. Same with telling the story of a pathologically stressed out Adam Sandler character. You make the movie stressful in every way possible. You're putting the audience in his shoes. You're making for a more immersive encounter with the movie. And that is the heart of the Paul Thomas Anderson alienation effect. If his movie is off-putting, it's usually because of some psychological explanation and a reason that involves getting closer to the protagonist's headspace. So I have now talked about a few of the most common ways that people talk about Anderson's filmography. These are movies about family, they're movies about masculinity. But another pretty major running thread is Anderson's relationship to faith and belief. Several of his movies have dealt openly with religion, and the ones that don't engage with organized religion still have spiritual elements, often through some focus on chance or fate or coincidence, all of which seem to be assigned to some higher power. Anderson was raised as a mid-grade Catholic, as he calls it. They apparently only went to church when things were not going his mom's way. So his movies do not have a particularly penetrating fascination with Christianity. He is probably never going to make his last temptation to Christ. Instead, the most significant type of faith in Anderson's work is the idea of faith in a person, specifically someone that you might describe as a cult leader. It's maybe my favorite shot in any of his movies. That image just gets me. Anderson's 2012 film, The Master, is pretty openly based on the rise of Scientology, with Philip Seymour Hoffman's character there being a clear pastiche of L. Ron Hubbard. But there is a clear link between that character and the early 20th century faith healer of There Will Be Blood, and the late 20th century radical misogynist motivational speaker in Magnolia. Neither of those characters is referred to as a cult leader, but Anderson clearly sees something very troubling in this idea of putting your faith in someone, rather than the private and personal rewards of faith in a higher power. Interestingly, he is skeptical of faith leaders, but not necessarily the effects of faith itself. In both There Will Be Blood and The Master, characters encounter these forces of religious faith. They get taken for a little bit of a ride, but they emerge stronger for their encounter with faith. They have not brought that faith with them, but the encounter was enough to lead to some personal improvement. Finally, I want to talk about Anderson's relationship to history. He has not made a movie set in the present day in over 20 years now. He has turned his eye decisively toward the past, and when he is asked about it, he tends to describe the modern world as a sort of boulder that we are all chained to that is dragging us down. So instead, he wants to tell stories about the past, to look back and take stock. A lot of his movies straddle a sort of epoch shift, like the end of World War II in The Master, or the death of the 60s in Inherent Vice, these moments when history shifted and things got a little more complicated. That seems to be a very romantic notion for him. He has said that's when things get good. But the thing about Anderson's approach to history is, it is not all that historical. He cares a lot more about his chosen effects than he cares about historical accuracy, and this manifests in little ways and big ones. He will use a song that is released a few years after the movie is set, or with Licorice Pizza, he takes the real-life John Peters, and turns him into this howling macho caricature. Anderson has described himself as both a shark and a vampire. He will take whatever facts he is interested in and leave the remainder on the floor behind him. Naturally, when you are making historical fiction, you take liberties. It's storytelling, it's not school. But this tends to be one of my favorite one-sided rivalries in current film culture. There is a rivalry between Paul Thomas Anderson and the World Socialist Website, which is an organization that hates Paul Thomas Anderson and everything he stands for. Going back to There Will Be Blood, there was this big epic of the early days of the oil trade. The critics at the World Socialist Website have been disgusted with Anderson for ignoring the socio-political implications of his work. There Will Be Blood is an interesting case study in terms of Anderson's disinterest in history's complications. The movie is closely based on Upton Sinclair's novel Oil, but Anderson leaves the book behind at a certain point, and the point at which he walks away is the point at which the novel's characters become activated by labor concerns and turn towards unionization and socialism. That's the reality of the situation of the early 20th century oil fields, but Anderson found all of that clearly uninteresting. Instead, he turned his storytelling eye away from the book at that point and made up a new ending that completely ignores labor, unions, and socialism. And this naturally made the World Socialist Website incredibly angry. And they have carried that grudge against Anderson across every movie since. Inherent Vice, Phantom Thread, Licorice Pizza, The Master were all criticized for not engaging sufficiently with the socio-political implications of their stories. I think the World Socialist Website has something like a point. I think they take it a little bit far, but I do think that it's clear that Anderson sees history not as a collection of facts, but as something like a toolkit or a toy box or a paint set, something to play with. He sets his movies not in America's past, but in snow globe worlds where the American experiment plays out in different permutations. The writer George Toles believes that Anderson sees the San Fernando Valley as a place of mythic consequence, but I think that accounts for not just his vision of the valley, but his vision of the world. There is a subtle touch of magical thinking to Paul Thomas Anderson's worldview that transcends realism. In The Master, cult leader Lancaster Dodd is caught editing the ending to his own religious text. Previously, the book suggested that transcendence was accessed by recalling the past. Now it reads that you must imagine the past in order to achieve transcendence. This is what interests Anderson, the imagined vision of the past, not the recalled one. It gets Dodd into trouble. He is labeled a hypocrite. And prizing imagination over recollection has brought Anderson his share of criticism too. But in Dodd's view, recalling and imagining are one and the same. They are just two avenues to the same destination, the possibility of maybe finally understanding why we're here. Across 9 features of varying genre and setting, Paul Thomas Anderson has created a remarkably consistent thematic galaxy. I want to thank you for joining me to talk through a few of the highlights. Oh, thank you.